The Grand Canyon is one of the most photographed places on Earth. 5 million people a year stand at the South Rim, take the same picture everyone else takes, buy the same postcard, and drive home. Almost none of them notice what is scattered across the plateau and canyon country around it. There is a town where the United States Postal Service still delivers mail by mule train because there are no roads in or out, and there never have been. There is a hotel room 220 feet underground, stocked with crackers and medical kits the federal government left behind in case of nuclear war and never picked back up. There is a town that was run for decades by one man, a man who could reassign a family's wives and children with a single order and answer to nobody. And there is a ghost town so violent, even by the standards of the frontier West, that its first 6 lawmen were reportedly all killed in the line of duty, one of them before his first shift was even over. That story is number 1 on this list, and once you hear the detail that comes with it, you will understand exactly why it earns the spot. Welcome to the channel where we dig up the towns nobody puts on the postcards, the places history quietly walked past. If you have not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because we post deep dives exactly like this one every single week. Today we are counting down 10 of the strangest, darkest, and most forgotten places in the Grand Canyon region. Let's go! Number 10. Cameron, the bridge that built a town. Before 1911, there was one way across the Little Colorado River Gorge here, and it was a bad one. Tanner's Crossing was a rocky ford that flash floods could turn into a death trap without warning, swallowing wagons and livestock whole, no matter how careful the crossing. So the U.S. government stepped in and built something to solve the problem. A 660-foot suspension bridge, which at the time was the longest one west of the Mississippi River. 5 years later, 2 brothers named Hubert and C.D. Richardson looked at that bridge and saw an opportunity nobody else had claimed yet. They staked 112 acres of raw desert right beside it and put up a drafty tin-roofed shack where Navajo and Hopi families could bring their wool, their livestock, and their handmade goods to trade for dry goods and supplies. The business never really moved. The road just grew up around it, year after year, until the shack became a proper trading post and the trading post became a town. That original 1916 building is still standing today, now serving as a fine art gallery, and the trading post has hosted everyone from Navajo weavers demonstrating their craft to visiting movie stars filming nearby in the desert. And right beside the modern highway bridge, fenced off, unused, quietly rusting, the 1911 suspension bridge that started all of it still hangs across the gorge. A monument to the flood that never quite got the last word. Number 9. Hackberry, the ghost town that sells you a Coke. Hackberry has died twice, and both times it came back changed. The first death was 1919, when the silver dried up in a mine that had already produced roughly $3 million in gold and silver, and the boomtown that had grown up around all that ore emptied out almost overnight. The second death came decades later, in the late 1970s, when Interstate 40 rerouted traffic around Hackberry's stretch of old Route 66, and the general store that had kept the town alive sat locked and abandoned for 14 straight years. Here's the thing. In 1992, a Route 66 artist named Bob Waldmeyer, whose own father incidentally invented the corn dog on a stick, bought the wreck outright. Most people faced with a collapsing building would restore it. Waldmeyer filled his instead with dead gas pumps, faded license plates, and vintage signage, and left the decay exactly the way he found it. He nodded. 2 owners later, that same deliberately unrestored, half-ruined look is still the entire point of stopping here. Vintage cars from the 40s and 60s sit rusting in the lot. The outdoor payphone still works, and not for the sake of nostalgia. There is genuinely no cell signal out here, so if you need to call somebody from Hackberry, that dead-looking phone booth is your only option. A ghost town, in other words, that survives specifically because nobody ever bothered to clean it up. Number 8. Meteor City, the city with a population of 2. In 1938, a Texaco station opened on this stretch of flat desert scrub, named for a meteor crater roughly 6 miles away. Despite the name, it was never actually a city. It was one building run for years by a man who nicknamed himself Lonesome Jack, and who put up a roadside sign reading, quite literally, Population 1. Just him, alone in the desert, advertising his own solitude as a reason to stop. Then he got married, and the sign had to be updated to Population 2. That is the entire founding myth of Meteor City, and somehow it only got stranger from there. Later owners leaned all the way into the joke, building an eye-catching geodesic dome topped with a yellow mohawk stripe, filling it with what they called the world's largest dreamcatcher, and painting a 100-foot map of Route 66 across an exterior wall. For decades, it worked exactly as intended. Then the interstate moved the traffic elsewhere, roadside tourism collapsed nationally, and by December of 2012, the trading post closed for good. It was ransacked by vandals within 2 years. More than one owner has tried to save it since, including a couple who bought the property in 2016 specifically hoping to restore that dome. It still sits empty today, broken windows letting the wind through, concrete teepees standing guard over nothing. A city that peaked legally and officially at 2 residents and now has none at all. Number 7. Chloride, the ghost town that refuses to die. At its peak, Chloride had 5,000 people and 75 working mines pulling silver, gold, lead, and zinc out of the Sherbet Mountains. It was, for a while, the Mojave County seat. That was between 1900 and 1920, the good years. Then the ore ran out, the way it always eventually does, and in 1944 the mines shut down for good. The population that had once topped 5,000 collapsed to almost nothing, and Chloride spent the following decades hovering right at the edge of true ghost town status, one bad winter away from disappearing entirely. Here's the wild part. Instead of vanishing, the handful of people who stayed behind, many of them retirees who simply had nowhere else they wanted to be, decided to sell the decline itself as the attraction. They kept a post office running continuously since 1893, making it one of the oldest in the entire state. They let an artist named Roy Purcell paint a massive, sprawling psychedelic mural across a rock face above the town in 1966. And he came back to restore it in 1975. And again with a team of artists in 2005 and 2006. And twice a month, residents put on full-period costume and staged genuine gunfight reenactments in a mock Old West set built entirely from recycled mine lumber, complete with a jail, a saloon, and a doctor's office. Chloride is marketed today, almost with a wink, as a town that is technically still alive. Whether that officially disqualifies it from ghost town status or just makes it the most stubborn ghost town in Arizona depends entirely on who you happen to ask. Number 6. Grand Canyon Caverns, the motel room stocked for the apocalypse. In 1927, a woodcutter named Walter Peck nearly fell into a rain-widened hole in the ground while walking to a poker game one evening. He came back the next day with some friends, found a massive dry cavern system stretching out beneath the desert, and assumed the shiny rocks glittering inside meant gold. It was worthless pyrite. The cave got renamed several times over the following decades before finally settling on Grand Canyon Caverns in 1962, the exact same year Cold War planners decided this bone-dry, naturally climate-controlled space, more than 200 feet underground, was the perfect place to stockpile emergency rations in case of nuclear war. Water drums, boxes of crackers, medical kits. Enough supplies all told for 2,000 people to survive on for weeks. The war never came. The supplies were never touched. And here is the detail that stops most people cold. Decades later, someone converted part of that same fallout shelter into a functioning hotel room, and today you can pay roughly $1,000 a night to sleep 220 feet underground in total silence with zero cell signal, surrounded by unused Cuban Missile Crisis rations from 1962. There is also, somewhere in the darker corners of the cave system, a naturally mummified bobcat that visitors have nicknamed Mummified Bob. The site closed again in 2022 after an elevator malfunction briefly stranded 5 visitors below ground and reopened in June of 2025 under new ownership by the Supai tribe. As far as anyone has publicly said, the crackers are still down there, exactly where the government left them, waiting for an apocalypse that never showed up. We have covered some genuinely strange spots so far, and we are only about halfway through this list. If you are finding this video interesting, go ahead and drop a thumbs up and let us know in the comments which of these 10 places has surprised you the most. We genuinely read every single one of them. Because from here on out, the stories get considerably darker and considerably heavier. Number 5. Supai. The town the mail reaches on muleback. There are no roads into Supai, none at all. To reach it, you hike 8 miles and descend roughly 2,000 feet into a side canyon of the Grand Canyon. Or you take a helicopter, or you ride in on a horse. There are no cars in the entire community because there is nowhere for a car to drive once you get here. The Havasupai tribe has lived in this canyon for more than 800 years, farming land fed by silt washing down from the Colorado River right up until the late 1800s, when encroaching cattle ranchers and government-sanctioned mining pushed them off the high plateau above and confined them permanently to the canyon floor below. That isolation became both the tribe's protection and its defining hardship, cutting the community off entirely from roads, from cars, from the ordinary machinery of modern life. And here is what the U.S. Postal Service decided to do about it, rather than simply give up on the route. A contractor still trucks the mail 60 miles down an unpaved road to a trailhead, where it gets loaded onto a string of pack mules and carried the final 8 miles and roughly 2,000 feet down into the canyon, 6 days out of every week. Each mule can carry up to 200 pounds. Groceries, medicine, letters, prescriptions people are actually waiting on. It is the only place left in the entire United States where the mail still arrives this way, and it is not staged for tourists or maintained as some quaint historical reenactment. It is simply, to this day, the only method that works down there. The U.S. Department of Agriculture has called Supai the most remote community in the contiguous United States, and that remoteness cuts both ways. In 2018, a flash flood forced the helicopter evacuation of 200 visitors who had been stranded inside the canyon. The turquoise waterfalls that draw people to Supai in the first place are the exact same forces capable of sealing it off entirely, sometimes for months at a stretch. Nobody down there is running mule trains for the aesthetic of it. They are doing it because, in this particular canyon, on this particular trail, it remains the fastest and only reliable way in. Number 4. 2 Guns. The ghost town built on a massacre. In 1878, according to local lore passed down for generations, Navajo warriors trapped a group of rival Apache raiders inside a cave here and lit a fire directly at its mouth. 42 people reportedly died inside, unable to escape the smoke. Decades later, a homesteading couple's simple trading post sat right beside that same cave, quietly doing business until 1925, when a man calling himself Chief Crazy Thunder leased the surrounding land. His real name was Henry Miller. He had no Native American ancestry whatsoever. Here's the wild part. Miller turned the Death Cave into a full-paid tourist attraction, giving guided tours through it and selling the excavated skulls of the dead as souvenirs to passing travelers. He also built a roadside zoo on the property, stocked with mountain lions and other desert wildlife, all while feuding constantly with the land's actual legal owner, a man named Earl Cundiff. In 1926, that feud reached its breaking point when Miller shot Cundiff dead over a dispute about lease terms. He was acquitted on grounds of self-defense and promptly fled the state with a haul of jewelry and silver, leaving Cundiff's widow to rebuild the entire business from nothing on her own. The town limped along afterward as a modest Route 66 stop for several more decades until its last operating gas station burned down in a 1971 fire and the site was abandoned for good. Today, the ruins are still standing quietly a short walk off Interstate 40, collapsed zoo cages, a burned-out service station shell, the old Canyon Diablo bridge spanning the gorge below. A man once sold souvenirs carved out of a massacre and was killed on that very same ground less than a year later. Nobody who has spent time walking through those ruins seems to think the particular coincidence was really much of a coincidence at all. Number 3. Valentine, the town named for a broken heart. For decades, this tiny post office was famous for exactly one thing: its heart-shaped postmark. Thousands of Valentine's Day cards were mailed here every single February, specifically to get stamped with it, a small romantic tradition that people drove out of their way for. But the name itself had nothing romantic behind it at all. The settlement started in 1898 as Truxton, built directly around a federal boarding school for Hualapai children, and was only renamed Valentine in 1910 in honor of the sitting Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time. That school operated until 1937. Children arriving there had their hair cut and their clothes burned on arrival, part of a deliberate, government-sanctioned assimilation policy designed to erase their culture and language. Between October of 1918 and January of 1919, Spanish influenza swept through and killed 22 children and adults inside those same walls. So Valentine's charming postal reputation and its far more brutal history grew up side by side, largely unspoken about together, for most of the 20th century. Here's the detail that stops people cold. On August 15, 1990, an armed robber shot and killed the postmistress, a woman named Jacqueline Ann Grigg, inside that very same tiny post office. Her husband, in his grief, bulldozed the building himself soon afterward, rather than let it keep standing as a crime scene. That famous heart-shaped Valentine's postmark now only exists at the post office over in Kingman because the original building in Valentine was demolished the same year his wife was murdered inside it. The old Truxton Canyon schoolhouse itself is still standing today, fenced off, owned by the Hualapai tribe, waiting on restoration funding it may never actually receive. A town named after a bureaucrat's surname, remembered for years for a cheerful holiday postmark. Built on a documented history of forced assimilation and ended, for the people who lived there, by a single act of sudden violence. All of it true. All of it, somehow, the same small town. Number 2. Colorado City, the town one man controlled completely. Picture a town where one person legally owns almost all the land, effectively runs the local police department, and can decide, entirely on his own authority, which men keep their wives and children and which ones simply do not. That was Colorado City for the better part of 3 decades. It began in 1913 as Short Creek, founded by Mormon fundamentalists who refused to give up the practice of polygamy after the mainstream LDS Church formally renounced it back in 1890. The town's extreme physical isolation, straddling the Arizona-Utah border in the middle of nowhere, let its leadership entrench itself generation after generation, eventually consolidating almost total control under a prophet named Warren Jeffs. Virtually all the real estate in town belonged to a single church trust called the United Effort Plan. Jeffs personally controlled the shared police force serving both Colorado City and its Utah twin, Hilldale. And at the absolute height of his power, he could order 20 married men expelled from town in a single day and simply reassign their wives and children to other men instead, all while state and county authorities looked the other way for years at a stretch. That entire arrangement collapsed in 2011 when Jeffs was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 underage girls he had personally married off. Utah authorities had already begun seizing the church-controlled land back in 2005, and in 2014, a federal jury awarded a non-FLDS couple $5.2 million after ruling that the towns had discriminated against them by deliberately denying them basic utilities and police protection. The town spent years afterward under direct court supervision, which officials only lifted once they confirmed real, measurable progress had been made. Former members who chose to stay have spent that time since quietly rebuilding civic life from scratch, opening a winery, opening a brewery, even hosting a music festival in a place that had once forbidden its own children from playing organized youth sports. It stands today as a functioning, genuinely diversifying town, but it only got there after first surviving decades under one man's near-total control over almost every part of daily private life. Number 1. Canyon Diablo. You are standing on a flat, exposed stretch of high desert, and there is essentially nothing here. No buildings left standing, no people. Just a handful of stone foundations half buried in packed dirt, one wall still fully intact, and a single tombstone leaning slightly sideways in the constant wind. It took a rough, rattlesnake-populated dirt road just to get here, and once you actually arrive, the silence is almost total, broken only by the wind moving across the open canyon rim. It is genuinely hard, standing in that quiet today, to believe that this exact patch of ground once held 14 saloons, 10 separate gambling houses, and 4 brothels, all of them running 24 hours a day without ever closing. Here's the thing. Canyon Diablo did not start out as a town at all. It started as a stalled construction site. In 1880, Atlantic and Pacific Railroad crews hit the edge of this canyon and had to wait months for a longer bridge span to be shipped in from back east before construction could continue. thousands of idle railroad workers sitting on their wages with nothing to do drew saloon keepers, gamblers, and outlaws to the area almost overnight. The population reportedly swelled to somewhere around 2,000 people. The nearest actual law enforcement was over 100 miles away, and the camp policed itself the only way it apparently knew how, which was barely at all. According to a legend repeated across nearly every source written about this town, the first appointed marshal was sworn in at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and was dead by 8 that same night. 5 more marshals reportedly died after him, one after another, none lasting longer than a month on the job. It is worth being honest here. One careful modern researcher has traced much of that specific body count back to a single pulp fiction writer working decades after the fact, so the exact number deserves a little skepticism rather than blind repetition. What is not in dispute, though, is what happened here in April of 1905. 2 young men robbed a saloon over in Winslow, fled out to Canyon Diablo, and were tracked down by 2 local lawmen. In the shootout that followed, one of the robbers, a man named John Shaw, was killed on the spot and buried right there. When word reached the saloon back in Winslow, a group of drunken cowboys decided their friend had died with unfinished business. He had never gotten to actually drink the whiskey he'd stolen. So they hopped a train back out, dug up his coffin with borrowed shovels, propped his corpse against a nearby fence, poured whiskey down its throat, and photographed the entire toast for posterity. Those pictures reportedly hung on a saloon wall back in Winslow for decades afterward, treated less like evidence of a crime and more like a favorite local legend. Once the railroad bridge was finally completed around 1890, the entire boomtown emptied out within months, and the desert quietly reclaimed the rest. Today, this is what remains: a few scattered foundations, one standing wall, a single grave belonging to a trader named Herman Wolfe, and a reputation for violence that has clearly outlived the actual settlement itself by well over a century. Whatever exactly happened here, and however much of it got exaggerated somewhere along the way, the ground still remembers being called Hell Street. It simply is not telling anyone that anymore. This stretch of desert around the Grand Canyon holds a lot more than one famous hole in the ground. Isolation did strange things to the people who tried to settle it here. Some of them built kitsch, some of them built total control over other people's lives, and some of them built graves. For me, it's Canyon Diablo, a town so violent it apparently consumed its own lawmen, now reduced to a single wall and one grave that almost nobody bothers to visit. Which of these 10 places surprised you the most, or is there somewhere near the canyon that we completely missed? Tell us below, we do read all of it. And if you want more of these deep dives into forgotten American towns, go ahead and subscribe. We post one just like this every single week.